Get ready to be transported into the unknown. Welcome back to W-broux, your ultimate escape into chilling tales from the darkest corners of reality. If you're joining us for the first time or you're a returning listener, make sure to hit that subscribe button because here, the fear never sleeps. Before we dive into tonight's spine-tingling story, I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your location in the comments below. Are you tuning in from a dark bedroom, a long night drive, or maybe somewhere even more mysterious? Also, make sure to like the video if you're ready to embrace the darkness with me tonight. Your support keeps the nightmares coming. Story 1: The Cursed Clock. Aaron had never considered himself a superstitious man. He believed in logic, reason, and the concrete reality of things he could touch and see. His career as a civil engineer was built on precision and facts, not stories and myths. So when his grandfather's old house became his after the elder's sudden passing, Aaron viewed it as just a part of family responsibility. The house itself was ancient, nestled in a quiet neighborhood that seemed to have been forgotten by time. It was filled with relics of the past: books, furniture, and trinkets, each a testament to the old man's love for collecting. Aaron's grandfather had been a man of eccentric tastes, always talking about history, artifacts, and items with character. Among the myriad objects in the house, one stood out most to Aaron: the antique clock that had hung above the fireplace in the parlor for as long as he could remember. The clock was striking in its age and craftsmanship. It was a grand old thing, tall, with an oak body that had long since darkened from years of dust and polish. The brass pendulum swung gently beneath its face, though the clock hands themselves hadn't moved in decades, stuck at exactly 3:15. His grandfather had often spoken of the clock, though Aaron had dismissed the stories, chalking them up to an old man's fondness for dramatics. After settling into the house, Aaron would occasionally glance at the clock, admiring its old-world charm. But to him, it was just a relic of a time long past, nothing more. That changed on the evening of November 6th. It had been a normal day. Aaron had spent most of the afternoon organizing his grandfather's paperwork, sorting through old journals and letters that spoke of travels to far-flung places. That night, the house felt colder than usual, a biting chill creeping in through the drafty windows despite the fire roaring in the hearth. As Aaron relaxed in the parlor, flipping through a book, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in years. Tick, tock, tick, tock. He glanced up. The clock was ticking. Its pendulum, which had remained motionless since his grandfather's death, now swayed gently back and forth with a smooth, rhythmic motion. Aaron frowned. How was that possible? The clock had been broken for years, its mechanisms long corroded by time. He stood and approached it, peering up at the hands. They were still stuck at 3:15, but the ticking continued, steady and clear. A sense of unease washed over him, but Aaron shrugged it off. He figured maybe the pendulum had shifted after he accidentally brushed against the clock earlier. He went to bed, thinking nothing more of it. The next day, however, the ticking was louder. Aaron woke up early, groggy from a night of restless sleep. As he descended the stairs, he noticed the house felt heavier, like the air itself had thickened overnight. The ticking of the clock greeted him before he even reached the bottom step, a sharp contrast to the quiet of the morning. Tick, tock, tick, tock. He walked into the parlor and stared at the clock. It was louder than it had been the previous evening. It echoed off the walls, and yet the hands still hadn't moved, still frozen at 3:15. Irritated, Aaron removed the glass cover and carefully inspected the clock's gears and mechanisms. Everything seemed fine. The clock wasn't broken in any noticeable way, But no matter what he did, the hands remained stuck. He tried to push the growing feeling of unease to the back of his mind. It was just a clock, an old, stubborn clock. But as the days passed, the ticking became unbearable. It followed him through the house, growing louder at odd intervals. Even at night, as Aaron lay in bed, the sound seemed to seep through the walls, worming its way into his dreams. Each time he closed his eyes, the pendulum swung in his mind, its rhythmic movement relentless. And each time, in his dream, the hands of the clock slowly crept closer to 3:16. The dreams became more vivid, more real. Aaron found himself waking up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, the ticking still echoing in his ears. The house felt wrong. What once was his safe retreat now felt like a prison, each room suffocating, every corner darker than it should be. By the fifth night, Aaron couldn't take it anymore. He decided to silence the clock for good. It was late, and the storm outside rattled the windows as Aaron approached the clock. His hands shook slightly as he reached up to stop the pendulum. But as soon as he touched the brass rod, a shiver ran through him, a coldness that spread from his fingertips to the very core of his being. The pendulum resisted, almost as if it had a life of its own. Suddenly, the hands of the clock moved. Aaron froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The hands jerked forward, 1 minute at a time, until they finally landed on 3:16. The ticking stopped. Silence filled the room. But it wasn't the kind of silence that brings peace. No, this silence was heavy, oppressive, like the air itself had been drained from the room. Aaron stepped back, breathing heavily, staring at the clock in disbelief. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were soft, almost imperceptible. Aaron strained to hear, thinking they were part of his imagination. But as he stood there, rooted to the spot, the whispers grew louder. They came from the clock, swirling around him like a chorus of voices, each one indistinct but unmistakably malevolent. Aaron stumbled backward, his pulse racing. He turned to leave the room, but something caught his eye, a shadow flickering behind the glass of the clock. He turned back, his eyes wide with terror. Behind the clock's face, something moved. At first, it was just a blur, a trick of the light, maybe. But as Aaron squinted, the figure took shape. It was a face, gaunt and hollow, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The face was watching him, its lips curling into a twisted smile. Aaron's breath hitched in his throat as the figure raised a bony finger and pointed directly at him. His heart pounded in his chest as the whispers intensified, filling the room with a low, droning hum that rattled his skull. "Time's up," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping, guttural sound that sent shivers down Aaron's spine. Panicking, Aaron grabbed the clock from the wall and hurled it to the floor. The clock crashed to the ground, but the glass didn't shatter. It lay there, completely intact, its hands still frozen at 3:16. Aaron backed away, his hands trembling. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. The room began to spin, the walls closing in. He felt the weight of something dark and ancient pressing down on him, suffocating him. Suddenly, the clock began ticking again. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The pendulum swung wildly, faster and faster, until the ticking became a blur of sound. The hands of the clock spun faster than they ever should have, racing backward as if time itself was unraveling. Aaron tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, trapped by the force that now consumed the house. The whispers turned to shrieks, and the figure inside the clock pressed its face against the glass, grinning wildly as the clock hands spun in reverse. and then everything stopped. The clock fell silent. The whispers ceased. The room returned to stillness. Aaron collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. His heart pounded in his ears, but the suffocating pressure was gone. He looked up at the clock. The hands were once again frozen at 3:15, and the pendulum had stopped swinging. For a brief moment, Aaron thought it was over. The nightmare had passed. He was safe. But then he noticed something. The figure inside the clock wasn't gone. It was standing right behind him. Aaron turned just in time to see a shadow envelop him, and the world went black. Time is a strange thing, isn't it? One moment you're in control, and the next, you're caught in its relentless grip. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. But remember, time waits for no one, and in the end, we all have to face the ticking of the clock. Story 2: The Silent Watcher. After Aaron's aunt passed away, the family gathered to sort through her belongings. Aaron had always found his aunt to be an enigma, an eccentric woman who lived alone in a large, secluded house on the outskirts of town. She had been fiercely independent, deeply private, and always distant from the rest of the family. Her house was much the same, oddly quiet and full of strange, mismatched furniture and countless trinkets she'd collected over the years. But the attic, that was where her secrets lay hidden. When the family began to clear out her possessions, Aaron volunteered to tackle the attic. It was a place he'd never been allowed to enter as a child, but now as an adult, he felt both curiosity and dread as he climbed the narrow, creaky stairs. The attic door groaned as he pushed it open, revealing a room cloaked in shadows, illuminated only by a single, dusty window. The air was thick with the scent of old books and cedar, mingling with the dust that seemed to hang suspended in the air. As Aaron stepped inside, he felt a strange sense of being watched, a prickling on the back of his neck that made him pause. He glanced around the room, but it was empty. Just piles of forgotten belongings, boxes filled with old letters, records, and strange collectibles. But one box in particular caught his eye. It was tucked away in the far corner of the attic, almost hidden beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers. Unlike the others, it was sealed shut with a thick layer of tape. Aaron felt an inexplicable pull toward it. His curiosity piqued. As he dragged the box into the center of the room, he noticed how heavy it felt, as if the contents were more than just old memories. With a sharp blade, Aaron carefully cut through the tape and opened the box. Inside, he found a collection of photographs, hundreds of them, in various sizes and states of decay. Some were faded, their edges curled with age, while others remained as vibrant as the day they were taken. Aaron began flipping through them, and his heart began to race. The first photograph he pulled out was of him taken at his 10th birthday party. There he was, laughing with friends, frosting smeared on his face, completely unaware that anyone had been watching. The next photograph showed him at the park, sitting on a swing, his feet kicked up in the air, a wide grin on his face. But as he continued to sift through the photos, something unsettling began to emerge. These weren't just innocent snapshots from family gatherings or childhood events. No, these were intimate moments, private moments that Aaron had no recollection of anyone ever capturing. There was a photo of him sitting alone on a park bench, staring off into the distance. Another showed him at a school play, hidden behind a curtain, his eyes wide with anticipation. He hadn't even known there was a camera that day. Each photo was taken from a distance, as if someone had been following him, documenting his every move without his knowledge. Aaron's unease deepened as he pulled out more and more photos. There was one of him drawing in his notebook while sitting on his aunt's porch. Another of him walking home from school, his expression thoughtful. But it was the photo at the bottom of the box that made his blood run cold. It was a close-up shot of his hands dirty with paint as he worked on a canvas in the backyard. He remembered that day clearly. It had been a warm summer afternoon, and he'd spent it painting with his aunt. But this photo wasn't taken by anyone in his family. It was taken from the edge of the woods, far enough away to go unnoticed, but close enough to capture every detail. Aaron set the photographs down and took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. Why had his aunt taken these pictures? And why hadn't she ever told him about them? It felt invasive, like she had been chronicling his life without his consent, creating a hidden archive of his most private moments. Just as he was about to close the box, something else caught his eye: an envelope, nestled at the bottom, beneath the last few photographs. His fingers trembled as he pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a letter, written in his aunt's distinctive, flowing cursive. "My dearest Aaron," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. I want you to understand the importance of these photographs. They are not just memories, they are pieces of you that I wanted to celebrate." Aaron's eyes scanned the page, his emotions swirling between confusion, anger, and sadness. "You have always been a bright light in my life, and I wanted to capture your essence in ways I felt were authentic and true. I know you may not understand now, but one day you will see what I saw in you: the artist, the dreamer, the child who saw the world in ways others could not." As Aaron read on, his feelings of invasion began to shift. His aunt wrote of her love for him, her desire to preserve the moments that shaped who he was. She spoke of her belief that Aaron was special, someone who had the potential to create great beauty in the world. The photographs were her way of reminding him of that potential, of the quiet moments that defined him when no one else was watching. Tears welled in Aaron's eyes as he reached the final lines of the letter. "I hope these photographs remind you of the beauty you bring into this world, even when you cannot see it yourself. You are an artist in your own right, and I will always be your silent cheerleader, even in death. Never forget that you are loved." The knot in Aaron's stomach slowly began to loosen. His aunt hadn't been spying on him out of malice, she had been watching out of love. She had seen in him what he often failed to see in himself. The photographs were her way of immortalizing the quiet moments that made him who he was. With newfound appreciation, Aaron returned to the box and looked through the photographs again. This time he saw them differently. The unease he had felt before was replaced by a sense of warmth, of connection. He could see his aunt's love in each frame, the way she had captured his small victories, his moments of joy, and his times of reflection. Over the next few weeks, Aaron began to embrace the creativity his aunt had always seen in him. He hung the photographs around his home, each one a reminder of the love that had shaped him, the quiet encouragement he had never realized was there. He even started painting again, allowing himself to get lost in the same creative process he had once shared with his aunt. But as the days passed, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. It was subtle at first, a shadow in the corner of his vision, the feeling of eyes on the back of his neck as he worked on his paintings. But as the days turned into weeks, the sensation grew stronger, more insistent. One night, as he was cleaning his brushes in the dim light of his studio, he glanced up at the window and froze. There, reflected in the glass, was a figure standing just behind him, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. His heart raced as he whipped around, but the room was empty. Aaron's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the space where the figure had been. The air around him felt heavy, thick with a presence he couldn't explain. He turned back to the window, his hands shaking, but the figure was gone. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, marking each second that passed in deafening silence. And then, just as Aaron's heart began to calm, he heard it, a soft, familiar whisper, drifting through the quiet room. "I'll always be watching." Sometimes the ones we love never truly leave us, even when we think we're alone. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more unsettling stories. Remember, you never know who might be watching from the shadows. Story 3: The Darkened Halls. After the funeral, the house felt like a shell of its former self. The laughter and warmth that had once filled every room had vanished, replaced by a hollow silence that echoed through the darkened halls. Eric hadn't wanted to return, not to this place filled with memories and now shadows, but after his parents passed away, he had no choice. He needed to sort through their belongings, clean out the house, and decide what to do with the place. As he unlocked the front door, a familiar scent greeted him, the smell of old wood, worn carpets, and lingering perfume from his mother's favorite bottles. He stood in the doorway, taking in the stillness of the house, and felt the weight of the loss settle over him. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt right. The home that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a stranger. Eric wandered from room to room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Every corner of the house seemed to carry an echo of the past birthdays, Christmas mornings, quiet dinners by the fireplace. But with each step he took, those echoes became distant, more like faded photographs than living memories. The house was no longer a home, it was a tomb for his parents' life. The stairs creaked as he ascended, the wood groaning under his weight. When he reached the second floor, he hesitated outside his old bedroom door. The air was heavier here, thick with something he couldn't name. His hand lingered on the door handle, a knot forming in his stomach. He had always felt safe in his room as a child, but now it felt like something was waiting for him inside. Pushing the door open, Eric was hit with a wave of cold air. The room was just as he had left it all those years ago. Posters still hung on the walls, his childhood books lined the shelves, and the bed was neatly made, as if waiting for him to climb in. But there was something wrong. The closet door, slightly ajar, seemed to beckon him. His mother had always been meticulous, making sure everything was in its place. That door shouldn't have been open. Eric swallowed hard and stepped into the room. As he crossed the floor, the feeling of being watched crept up his spine, the fine hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He stopped in front of the closet, the shadows inside seeming deeper than they should have been. With a shaky hand, he pulled the door open. The closet was cluttered with old clothes and forgotten toys, the remnants of his childhood gathering dust. But in the far corner, tucked behind a stack of boxes, was something he hadn't seen before, a small leather-bound diary. Its cover was worn, the leather cracked with age. How long had it been there, hidden in the dark? Curiosity piqued. Eric reached in and pulled the diary out, brushing off the dust. It felt heavy in his hands, as though it carried the weight of secrets long buried. The handwriting on the first page was unmistakable. It belonged to his mother. August 12th, 1998. Today I found out I'm pregnant. Eric's breath caught in his throat. This was his mother's journal, her thoughts from the time before he was born. He hadn't known she'd kept one. As he flipped through the pages, he felt an uncomfortable intimacy reading her words. His mother had been so strong, so confident, but her diary revealed a side of her he had never seen: her worries, her fears, her doubts. She had written about her joy at expecting a child, but also the uncertainty of the future. She had questioned whether she was ready to be a mother, whether she and his father could handle the responsibility.
But the further Eric read, the more the tone of the entries shifted. The joy was replaced with sorrow, the excitement with fear.
September 20th, 1999. Things aren't the way I thought they would be. I feel like the distance between us is growing. He doesn't understand what I need. I'm scared. Eric's stomach tightened. His parents had always seemed so solid, so united. But here, in these pages, his mother had written about the cracks in their marriage, the quiet arguments, the nights she spent alone in the living room while his father slept in their bed. He turned the page, his heart pounding. The next entry was dated a few months later, and the words were shaky, almost frantic. March 3rd, 2000. I don't know what to do. The fighting has gotten worse. I never thought it would come to this. I don't want to lose him, but I don't know how to fix this. The knot in Eric's stomach tightened. He had no memory of his parents ever fighting. They had always been affectionate, always supportive. But here, in his mother's own words, was a different story, a story of a marriage slowly unraveling. He kept reading, each entry revealing more of the hidden turmoil beneath the surface of his parents' seemingly perfect life. His mother had tried so hard to keep the family together, to hold on to the love she had for his father. But as the entries continued, the tone grew darker. January 15th, 2001. I found out about the affair today. He said it was a mistake, that it meant nothing, but I can't shake the feeling of betrayal. I need to protect our family. I need to protect Eric. Eric's hands began to shake. His father had an affair? He had never known. They had never told him. His mind reeled with the implications, his image of his father beginning to fracture. He had always believed his parents had built their life on love and trust, but now that belief felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. He turned the page again, desperate for more answers. April 18th, 2005. I finally told Eric. I couldn't keep it hidden anymore. He needs to know the truth. The affair. I can't forgive it, but I can't leave either. I need to protect him. Eric stopped. What had his mother told him? He didn't remember this conversation. He had no recollection of her ever sitting him down and revealing the truth about their marriage, about his father's betrayal. Had she meant to tell him but never followed through? Or had she told him when he was too young to understand? The diary ended abruptly after that entry. There were no more words, no more explanations, just silence. Eric closed the diary and sat down on the edge of his bed, his mind racing. He felt like his entire childhood had been a lie, a carefully constructed facade built to protect him from the truth. His parents had struggled, had fought, had kept secrets from him, and now those secrets had resurfaced, years after their deaths. The house felt colder than ever, the silence heavier. Eric stared at the closet, his thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion and anger. He had come back to this house to find closure, but instead he had uncovered a mystery that left him with more questions than answers. Suddenly, the door behind him creaked open. Eric's heart leapt into his throat as he turned, expecting to see something, but the doorway was empty. He stood, the old floorboards creaking under his weight, and stepped cautiously toward the hall. The house was silent still. But something had changed. As he descended the stairs, a chill ran down his spine. The shadows in the house seemed to shift, to stretch, as though they were watching him. He reached the bottom step and glanced toward the living room, where the familiar warmth of the fireplace had once brought comfort. The fireplace was cold now, the embers long dead, But in the flickering light from the windows, Eric saw something that made his blood freeze. In the center of the room, sitting on his father's old armchair, was a figure. At first, Eric thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But as he stepped closer, the figure remained solid, unmoving. It was a man, dressed in the same old cardigan his father used to wear. The man's face was hidden in the shadows, but Eric knew. He knew who it was. The figure slowly turned its head toward Eric, and though the face was obscured by darkness, Eric could feel the eyes on him, staring into his very soul. He froze, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The air in the room felt thick, like it was pressing in on him from all sides. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was undeniable. It was as though the house itself had come alive, the past merging with the present in a way that defied logic. Suddenly the figure stood, the chair creaking under its weight. It took one slow step toward Eric, and then another, the sound of its footsteps echoing through the silent house. Eric stumbled back, his heart racing, as the figure continued to advance. Panic surged through him, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He was trapped, caught in the web of his family's secrets, and now the shadows of the past had come to claim him. The figure reached out a hand, and Eric could feel the coldness emanating from it, a chill that seeped into his bones. But before the hand could touch him, the figure whispered, in a voice that was both familiar and foreign, "You should have never come back." Story 4, The Vanishing. The last time Emma saw Mia, they were sitting in their favorite coffee shop, chatting excitedly about Mia's upcoming road trip. Mia had been vibrant that day, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of adventure, her laughter filling the small cafe as she described all the places she planned to visit. They'd spent hours sipping coffee, planning routes, and imagining all the incredible sights Mia would see. But that was the last time Emma would ever hear Mia's laughter. A week later, Mia vanished. The days following her disappearance were a blur of confusion and panic. At first, everyone thought Mia had just extended her trip or maybe had gone off the grid. She'd always been spontaneous, after all. But when days turned into weeks and no one had heard a word from her, reality began to sink in. The police searched, her family pleaded for information, but it was as if Mia had disappeared off the face of the earth. No clues, no evidence, nothing. Emma couldn't let it go. Every day she woke up with a hollow ache in her chest, a gnawing sense of guilt that maybe, just maybe, she could have done something to stop it. She replayed their last conversation over and over in her mind, trying to find some hidden meaning, some clue she might have missed. But nothing ever stood out. Then, one evening, Emma's phone buzzed. She was sprawled on her couch, staring blankly at the TV, when Mia's name flashed across the screen. Emma's heart stopped. Her phone slipped from her hands and clattered onto the floor. It couldn't be. Mia's phone had been in police custody since her disappearance. There was no way she could be texting her now. But there it was, on the screen, Mia's name, followed by a single message. "You need to know the truth." Emma stared at the words, her hands trembling. It had to be a mistake, some cruel joke. But as she glanced at the time, she realized the message had been sent just minutes ago. Her stomach turned. She quickly texted back, her fingers fumbling over the keys. "Mia? Is that you? Where are you?" Her heart raced as she waited for a response, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. How was this possible? Was Mia alive? Was she trying to reach out? Minutes ticked by, each one more agonizing than the last. Just as Emma began to doubt she'd ever hear back, her phone buzzed again. "It's not safe to talk here. Meet me at the old park. Midnight. Alone." The blood drained from Emma's face. The old park? The one she and Mia used to visit when they were kids. The one on the outskirts of town where no one ever went anymore. It was crazy, completely insane. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Mia was reaching out to her, that she needed help. Despite the fear gnawing at her, Emma knew she had to go. If there was even the slightest chance Mia was alive, she had to take it. As the clock struck 11, Emma grabbed her jacket and keys, heading out into the cold night. The drive to the park was a blur, her thoughts racing faster than the car speeding down the dark, empty streets. The familiar winding road that led to the park was barely visible in the dim light of her headlights. The further she drove, the more isolated she felt, the darkness pressing in around her like a suffocating blanket. When she finally reached the park, Emma felt her heart skip a beat. The once beautiful park where she and Mia had spent so many afternoons now looked ominous under the pale moonlight. The swing sets were rusted, the playground equipment long abandoned and covered in shadows. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. She checked her phone again. No new messages. Taking a deep breath, Emma stepped out of the car and started toward the old oak tree where she and Mia used to sit. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her footsteps crunching over dead leaves. Her eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, but the park seemed deserted. Just as she reached the tree, her phone buzzed again. "Look under the tree." Emma's heart pounded as she knelt down, her hands shaking. She brushed away the leaves and dirt at the base of the oak, her fingers scraping against something cold and hard. A small metal box. She pulled it out, her breath catching in her throat. The box was old, its edges rusted and worn. With trembling hands, she pried it open. Inside was a bracelet, Mia's bracelet. Emma's stomach dropped. She remembered the day Mia had bought it, a simple silver chain with a tiny charm. But why was it here? Why hadn't the police found it? Next to the bracelet was a photograph. Emma's hands shook as she picked it up. It was a photo of her and Mia, taken years ago on one of their trips to the park. They were smiling, carefree, unaware of the dark future that awaited them. But it was the note at the bottom of the box that sent chills down her spine.
"I'm in trouble. They're watching me. Don't trust anyone." Emma's mind raced. What did this mean? Who was watching Mia? And why hadn't she told anyone before she disappeared? The questions tumbled over each other, but before Emma could think any further, she heard it.
Footsteps. Eyes. Her head snapped up, her eyes scanning the darkened park. Someone was coming. She stuffed the box back into the ground, her heart racing. The footsteps were growing louder, closer. Emma backed up against the tree, her pulse hammering in her ears. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden in the darkness. They were tall, their movements deliberate, as if they were searching for something or someone. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Were they looking for her? Did they know she was here? Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body was frozen in place. One of the figures spoke, his voice low and menacing. "She has to be around here somewhere. If she talks, it's over for all of us." Emma's blood ran cold. Who were they talking about? Mia. What had she gotten herself into? The second figure glanced around, his gaze sweeping across the park. "We'll find her. It's only a matter of time." Panic surged through Emma's body. She had to get out of there, but how? The car was too far away, and if she made a run for it, they'd see her for sure. She had no choice but to hide. Her eyes darted around the park, searching for anything that might provide cover. Then she spotted it, the old playground structure, half hidden in the shadows. Without thinking, she darted toward it, her footsteps as silent as she could manage. She crouched behind the rusted slide, her heart pounding in her chest, praying they wouldn't find her. The two figures moved closer to the tree, their voices now barely audible. Emma held her breath, her body trembling with fear. "Do you think she left the box?" one of them asked. "Doesn't matter," the other replied. "We'll find her. And when we do, she won't be able to run anymore." Emma bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. Who were these men? What did they want with Mia? And what had Mia discovered that made her such a target? Minutes felt like hours as the men continued their search, their voices growing fainter as they moved further away from the tree. Emma didn't dare move until she was certain they were gone. When the park was finally silent again, Emma crawled out from behind the slide, her legs shaky. She had to leave. She had to get to the police, tell them everything she'd found. But as she turned toward her car, her phone buzzed again. With trembling hands, she unlocked the screen. "Don't go to the police. They can't help you." The message was from Mia's number. Emma's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run. But she couldn't. Mia needed her, and whatever was going on, it was bigger than she'd realized. She looked out at the darkened park, the weight of the situation sinking in. Mia had been running from something dangerous. And now, it seemed, Emma was a part of it too. As she slipped the phone back into her pocket, she knew one thing for certain: the truth was out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And she wasn't going to stop until she found it. Story 5: The Eldridge Ritual. Eldridge had always seemed like an idyllic town at first glance. The streets were lined with old oak trees, and every cottage had flower boxes bursting with bright colors. It was the kind of place that people moved to in order to escape the chaos of city life, where everyone knew their neighbors and small-town charm was a way of life. That's exactly why Claire had chosen Eldridge when she decided to leave her high-stress job in the city. She wanted peace, quiet, and a place to start over. The town felt perfect, too perfect, but she brushed off that feeling as nerves from the move. For the first few weeks, life in Eldridge was everything Claire had hoped it would be. She found a cozy cottage to rent, started making small talk with the neighbors, and spent her afternoons at the local cafe, journaling and enjoying the slow pace of life. But something about Eldridge never quite felt right. It started with the people. Everyone was friendly, but there was something off in their interactions. When Claire went to the market or passed someone on the street, they smiled warmly enough, but their eyes seemed to be watching her too closely. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance, a little too much curiosity in their expressions, but it became harder to ignore. Even the barista at the cafe, Agnes, an older woman who seemed sweet and welcoming, gave Claire a strange feeling. Agnes would often watch her for just a moment too long before returning to her work, and when Claire asked her about the town's history or local traditions, she would evade the questions. "We have our ways," Agnes would say with a soft, cryptic smile. "Eldridge believes in balance. It's important for newcomers to respect that." Balance. What did that mean? Claire had brushed it off as small-town superstition, but the more time she spent in Eldridge, the more she realized that something deeper was at play. It wasn't just the odd glances or Agnes's cryptic warnings. It was the gatherings, the monthly meetings in the town square that everyone attended. Claire had been invited to the first one by her neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Brody, who insisted that every resident of Eldridge was expected to participate. "It's a tradition," Mrs. Brody had said with a smile. "Everyone in town comes. You'll enjoy it." When Claire arrived at the square that night, the atmosphere was electric. Long tables were set up with food and drink, and people were laughing and chatting as if it were any other community event. But as the night wore on, something shifted. As the clock struck midnight, the mood changed. The laughter faded into quiet murmurs, and people began gathering in a tight circle around the center of the square. Claire stood on the edge of the crowd, watching in confusion as the town's jovial spirit disappeared, replaced by something darker, more serious. At the stroke of midnight, a hush fell over the crowd. From the shadows emerged a man Claire had never seen before, tall and cloaked in dark robes, his face obscured by the hood. He walked slowly into the center of the circle, his movements deliberate and controlled. The townspeople began to chant. At first it was soft, barely audible above the sound of the wind, but the rhythm grew louder, their voices rising in unison as they repeated the same strange words over and over again. Claire couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sound sent a chill through her body. "What's going on?" Claire whispered to Mrs. Brody, who stood beside her with a serene smile on her face. "It's the ritual," Mrs. Brody said softly, her eyes never leaving the robed man in the center of the circle. "We keep the balance in Eldridge by honoring the unseen forces that protect us." Unseen forces. Claire felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "The forces that have watched over this town for generations," Mrs. Brody continued, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We've always given them what they need. It's why Eldridge has stayed so peaceful, so perfect." Before Claire could ask more, the chanting stopped. The robed man raised his hands into the air, and the crowd fell silent. The night was so quiet that Claire could hear her own heart pounding in her chest. The man began to speak in a language Claire didn't recognize, his voice deep and commanding. As he spoke, the air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around the square seemed to stretch and shift as if they were alive. Claire's breath caught in her throat as a heavy, oppressive feeling settled over the crowd. The robed man turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the townspeople, and then his eyes landed on Claire. For a moment, she was frozen in place, her body stiff with fear. His eyes locked onto hers, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. The knot of anxiety in her stomach twisted tighter. Something was terribly wrong.
Claire stumbled back, her mind racing. She needed to get out of there, to leave this town as fast as she could. But as she turned to leave, Mrs. Brody's hand closed around her wrist, holding her in place with surprising strength.
"You can't leave now," Mrs. Brody whispered, her eyes still fixed on the robed figure. "You're part of this now." Claire's heart raced. Part of what? Mrs. Brody's grip tightened. The balance must be maintained. Panic surged through Claire's body. She yanked her arm free from Mrs. Brody's grasp and backed away, her eyes darting around the square. The townspeople were still standing in their tight circle, their faces calm, their eyes empty. No one seemed to notice or care that Claire was leaving. She turned and ran. Her footsteps echoed through the empty streets as she fled the square, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness of the town closed in around her, and every shadow seemed to move. Every corner felt alive with watching eyes. Her mind screamed at her to get to her car, to drive far away from this cursed place. But when she reached her cottage, something stopped her in her tracks. A figure stood on the porch, half hidden in the shadows. It was the robed man from the square. Claire's blood ran cold. How had he gotten here so quickly? How had he known where she lived? "Claire," he said softly, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "You don't understand. The balance must be kept." She took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Stay away from me." He shook his head, his hood still concealing his face. "You don't have a choice. Eldridge needs you now. It's already begun." Without warning, the wind picked up, howling through the trees with a force that nearly knocked Claire off her feet. The shadows on the street seemed to ripple and twist, moving like living creatures, reaching out toward her with dark, clawed hands. Claire turned and bolted toward her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the keys. She could hear the man's voice behind her, calm and unhurried, as if he knew she couldn't escape. "The balance will be restored, Claire. It's only a matter of time." The engine sputtered as she turned the key, her heart slamming in her chest. The car roared to life, and she threw it into reverse, the tires screeching as she sped down the road. The darkness chased after her, the shadows bending and twisting in her rearview mirror. But no matter how fast she drove, the town wouldn't let her go. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before her, twisting and turning in impossible ways, leading her deeper into Eldridge's maze. The streetlights flickered and died, leaving only the pale glow of the moon to guide her way. The man's voice echoed in her mind. "You're part of this now." Finally, the car sputtered and stalled, leaving Claire stranded on the outskirts of the town, the oppressive silence closing in around her. She stepped out of the car, her body trembling as the weight of what had just happened sank in. Eldridge wasn't just a town. It was something more, something ancient, something hungry. And it had chosen her. As she stood on the empty road, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the robed man's final words. "You cannot escape the balance, Claire. It's already begun." Story 6, The Forgotten Room. After years of renting tiny apartments in the city, Ben couldn't believe his luck when he found the old Victorian house. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, and the landlord seemed eager to get someone moved in as quickly as possible. Ben didn't care, he was ready for a change. The house was beautiful, with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and stained glass windows that caught the afternoon light just right. But it wasn't long before Ben started noticing strange things about the house. There were creaks and groans in the night, which he chalked up to the age of the house, but something else felt off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The house was larger than he needed, with more rooms than he knew what to do with. There was the master bedroom, a guest room, a study, and a large kitchen, all connected by long, winding hallways. The day after he moved in, Ben spent hours exploring each room, amazed at how much space he suddenly had. It felt like a fresh start, a place where he could leave behind the chaos of the city and settle into something quieter, something more peaceful. But there was one door he couldn't open. It was in the far back of the house, down a hallway that always seemed colder than the rest. The door was old and weathered, its paint peeling away in long, jagged strips. Ben had tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. He figured it was just stuck, probably warped from years of humidity. He didn't think much of it. He had plenty of other rooms to use, and he wasn't in a rush to fix every little thing in the house. Still, the door bothered him. Every time he passed by it, he felt a strange sense of unease, like the door was hiding something. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger with each day that passed. One evening, as Ben was settling into bed, he heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. At first, he thought it was just the house settling, but then he realized the sound was too deliberate. It was coming from the direction of the locked door. He lay there, listening, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The tapping continued, slow and steady, as if someone or something was on the other side, waiting. The next morning, Ben decided he'd had enough. He was going to get that door open, if only to prove to himself that there was nothing to be afraid of. He went down to the hardware store and bought a set of tools, determined to force the door open if it came to that. When he returned home, he stood in front of the door, tools in hand, his heart racing. The hallway felt colder than usual, the air heavy with a strange, oppressive energy. He tried the knob again, still stuck. With a sigh, Ben grabbed a screwdriver and began prying at the door, his hands trembling slightly. After a few minutes of work, the door groaned and gave way. The musty smell of old wood and dust hit him immediately. Ben stepped inside, squinting in the dim light. The room was small, almost cramped, with peeling wallpaper and a single window that was so dirty it barely let in any sunlight. In the corner of the room sat an old wooden chest, its lid slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of him, and Ben crouched down to open the chest. Inside were old, dusty blankets yellowed with age, but as he dug deeper, his fingers brushed against something cold and hard. He pulled it out, a small, ornate box, carved with intricate designs that looked ancient. Ben's heart began to race. He could feel the weight of the box in his hands, heavy with mystery. There was no lock on it, just a simple latch. He hesitated for a moment, his mind screaming at him to stop, but his hands moved on their own. With a soft click, he opened the box. Inside was a stack of old, faded photographs. The edges were frayed, and the black and white images had begun to blur with time. Ben carefully picked up the first photo. It showed a family, a mother, father, and a little boy, standing in front of what looked like a carnival tent. They were smiling, but there was something wrong with the picture. The smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. In fact, the mother's eyes seemed to be looking just past the camera, as if she was watching something or someone standing behind the photographer. Ben flipped to the next photo. It was the same family, but this time they weren't smiling. They were standing in front of the same tent, but the boy was missing. The mother's face was twisted in terror, and the father's expression was one of shock. Ben's hands began to tremble as he flipped through the rest of the photographs. Each one showed the family again, but in every photo, something was wrong. First, the boy was gone. Then the mother. Finally, only the father remained, standing alone in front of the carnival tent, his face blank, his eyes hollow. Ben's stomach churned as he reached the final photograph. It was of the same house he was standing in now. The front porch, the windows, the door, it was unmistakable. But there was someone standing on the porch. A man. Ben squinted, trying to make out the figure's face, but the photo was too faded. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped even lower, and Ben felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He shoved the photographs back into the box and slammed the lid shut, his heart racing. He had to get out of that room. As he turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own. Panic surged through him. He rushed to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't open. It was stuck just like before. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he banged on the door, desperate to escape. Then he heard it. The soft, shuffling sound, like something moving across the floor behind him. Ben froze, his hands clenched around the door handle, his knuckles white. He didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what was behind him. But the sound was getting closer, inching toward him, slow and deliberate. He turned. In the far corner of the room, where the old chest sat, a figure was crouched. Its back was to him, hunched over, its hands moving frantically over the chest, as if it was searching for something. Ben's throat tightened as the figure slowly began to rise, its movements jerky and unnatural. The figure turned, and Ben's heart stopped. It was the man from the photograph. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched too tightly over his skull, his eyes hollow and empty. He stared at Ben, unblinking, his lips twisting into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have opened the box," the man rasped, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Now it's your turn." Ben backed up against the door, his body trembling uncontrollably. The man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "You can't leave," the man whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of Ben's heart. "You're part of this now." Before Ben could react, the figure lunged at him, its cold, bony fingers wrapping around his throat. He gasped for air, his vision blurring as the room seemed to spin around him. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the man's hollow, empty eyes staring into his soul. Ben was never seen again. The next tenant to move into the house found the door to the back room sealed shut, just as it had been before. When they asked the landlord about it, he simply shrugged and said, "Some doors are better left closed." Here's the revised version of Story 7. It started as a vague sense of unease, a creeping sensation that something wasn't quite right in my apartment. At first, I brushed it off as the product of a long week and too many late nights at work. But as I went about my daily routine, I began to notice strange symbols etched onto the walls. They were faint but unmistakable, appearing in the corners of rooms, hidden in shadows, as if waiting to be discovered. The first one I spotted was a small spiral shape in the living room, almost resembling a nautilus shell. I thought it was just a random scratch, or maybe an old mark on the paint, but the feeling of something deliberate lingered in my mind. Curiosity soon morphed into obsession as more symbols appeared, jagged lines forming geometric shapes, crude figures with hollow eyes, and patterns that seemed to twist and intertwine like roots burrowing into the wall. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I decided to document them. I grabbed my phone, snapping pictures of each marking, my pulse quickening with every shot. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like an eerie puzzle, each symbol a piece of a dark message I couldn't yet decipher. I spent hours online, researching, combing through forums about supernatural phenomena, and stumbled upon threads discussing occult symbols and ancient rituals. What I found chilled me to the bone. These weren't just random marks, they were tied to dark rituals, summoning signs, and protection wards against otherworldly entities. Some were even said to signify sacrifice. The more I read, the more it felt like my apartment wasn't just haunted, it was becoming a gateway to something much darker. Panic gripped me as I tried to make sense of how these marks had come to be in my home. Days turned into nights of restless sleep. I found myself avoiding the darkened corners of the apartment, keeping the lights on as much as possible, but the symbols seemed to spread like a virus. They multiplied overnight, creeping onto the ceilings, etching themselves into places I hadn't noticed before. Was I losing my mind, or had something truly sinister taken root in my life? Then, one sleepless night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. With a mix of desperation and fear, I searched for a way to cleanse my space. I found an ancient ritual involving sea salt, sage, and a protective chant. Feeling foolish but determined, I gathered the materials and started the ritual, sprinkling salt in the corners of each room and lighting the sage, letting its smoke curl through the air. As I chanted the words I'd learned, the symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer, their lines wavering as if recoiling from the cleansing smoke. The air grew thick, and a loud bang echoed from the back of the apartment. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, expecting to see something emerge from the darkness, but nothing was there. Only silence. For a moment, it seemed to work. The oppressive atmosphere lightened, and the weight that had been pressing down on me seemed to lift. I felt a flicker of hope, believing I might have finally driven away whatever dark force had latched onto my home. But my relief was short-lived. That night, as I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. I turned slowly, dread rising like bile in my throat. The wall behind me was covered in symbols darker, more vivid than ever before. They pulsed with a life of their own, twisting and writhing like living creatures trapped within the plaster. A whisper filled the air, a low chorus of voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You are not alone," they chanted in unison, their words vibrating through the air, resonating in my bones. I backed away, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The symbols seemed to reach out toward me, pulling me closer, as if they were alive. I knew then that this was more than just a haunting, it was a malevolent force that had awakened, and it wanted me to know that I was trapped. Summoning all my courage, I shouted, "Show yourself." "What do you want from me?" The room seemed to hold its breath, the air crackling with anticipation. And then, all at once, the symbols stopped moving. The whispering ceased, and a single phrase echoed in the silence, spoken in a voice that was not my own but seemed to come from deep within my soul. "Your fear feeds us." I felt my knees go weak, a cold sweat drenching my skin. The realization hit me like a slap in the face. Whatever this force was, it was feeding off my terror, growing stronger the more frightened I became. I was not just a victim, I was a source of power for something I couldn't see or comprehend. Determined not to give in, I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, forcing my mind to calm, to block out the fear. "You don't control me," I said, my voice trembling but steady. "I am not afraid of you." The moment the words left my mouth, the symbols flickered, their brightness dimming. The air seemed to relax, as if my defiance had weakened their hold. I opened my eyes to find the markings faded, almost invisible, as if my courage had sapped their energy. The voices were silent, the whispering gone. I knew then that I had found a way to fight back, not with rituals or chants, but with my own resolve. As I looked around the room, I felt a surge of strength. The battle was far from over, but I had discovered the key to facing this darkness. It was not about banishing the evil, it was about denying it the one thing it needed most, my fear. Story 8, The Invitation. The invitation arrived on a rainy evening, sealed in a sleek black envelope with a wax stamp that bore an intricate symbol. The envelope felt heavy in my hand, as though it carried more than just paper. I hesitated before opening it, a chill crawling up my spine. Flipping it over, I half expected some kind of prank, but the ornate lettering on the front was both elegant and unsettling. "You are cordially invited to an exclusive gathering at Willowcrest Manor," the note read. The name stirred a long-buried memory from my childhood and old mansion that had loomed on the outskirts of town, shrouded in whispers of tragedy and haunted tales. Growing up, kids would dare each other to approach the property, but no one ever did. It was said that those who went in never came back out the same. Despite the unease that gripped my chest, curiosity gnawed at me. I hadn't thought about Willowcrest Manor in years, not since I'd moved away to start a new life far from the ghost stories of my youth. Maybe this was my chance to confront those old fears, to put the past behind me once and for all. With a deep breath, I decided to accept the invitation. As I drove through the winding roads that led to the manor, the fog thickened, swallowing the headlights of my car. Shadows stretched across the landscape like long fingers. The trees on either side of the road twisted and gnarled, as if they were trying to close in on me. I could almost feel their branches scratching against the car windows, urging me to turn back, but I pressed on. The wrought iron gates of Willowcrest Manor creaked open as I approached, almost as if they were expecting me. The manor stood at the end of a gravel path, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the night sky. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, and the windows gleamed like black eyes, watching my every move. A flicker of lanterns cast dim light on the entrance, their flames sputtering in the chill air. When I stepped inside, the heavy wooden door swung shut behind me with a resounding thud. I found myself in a grand foyer filled with people dressed in elaborate attire, their faces half hidden in shadows. The chandelier overhead flickered, casting strange patterns on the cracked marble floors. An unsettling silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the hushed murmurs of the guests. The room felt trapped in a different era, the faded elegance of the discord clashing with the underlying decay. Old portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring out with eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I moved. I shuddered, suddenly aware of how out of place I felt. It was as if I had walked into a scene from a Gothic novel, a world that didn't quite belong to this time or place. I tried to strike up a conversation with a nearby guest, a man in a black suit who seemed to be looking at me with a peculiar intensity. He offered me a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "First time at Willowcrest?" he asked, his voice smooth yet laced with something darker. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on here?" He simply nodded, his smile growing wider. "You'll see soon enough. Tonight's gathering is special." Before I could ask him anything else, a bell tolled from somewhere deep within the mansion, its sound echoing through the hallways like a funeral knell. The guests all turned in unison toward the grand staircase at the back of the room. At the top of the stairs stood a figure draped in shadows, a man whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. He wore a black suit that seemed to blend into the darkness itself, and when he smiled, it was more a baring of teeth than an expression of warmth. "Welcome to Willowcrest Manor," he announced, his voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. "Tonight, we gather to celebrate the old traditions and to welcome a new guest into our midst." His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt as though he were staring straight into my soul. "Please join us in the dining hall," he continued. "The real festivities are about to begin." I was led into a vast room, its centerpiece a long dining table draped in crimson cloth. Candles in tall, ornate holders lined the table, their flames flickering with an otherworldly blue light. The chairs were already filled with guests, each of them donning masks that were eerily similar to their own faces, yet distorted in subtle, unsettling ways. I hesitated at the threshold, but the man in the black suit appeared at my side, gently guiding me to the only empty seat left. "You must take your place," he said softly, though his grip on my arm was firm. "After all, the feast cannot begin without our guest of honor." I swallowed hard and sat down, feeling the weight of 100 eyes upon me. The air was heavy, charged with anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. The plates before us were empty, but the air was filled with the smell of iron and earth, a scent that reminded me of freshly turned soil at a graveyard. "What is this?" I finally asked, the words trembling from my lips. Why am I here? A slow smile spread across the face of the man in the black suit. You are here because you have been chosen, he said, each word deliberate, dripping with malice. Tonight, we honor the cycle that keeps this place alive. You, my dear, are the offering. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls bending and warping as if the manor itself was alive, feeding on my fear. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like lead, and my breath came in short gasps. The guests began to chant in unison, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm, speaking words in a language I couldn't comprehend. The candles dimmed, and the shadows on the walls began to move, twisting, elongating, taking on shapes that no longer resembled anything human. Faces appeared within those shadows, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. The room spun around me, and I felt a cold hand close around my wrist, pulling me down. I screamed as the floor beneath my chair gave way, and I was plunged into darkness. I landed hard in a hidden chamber below, the air damp and suffocating. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and I realized I was surrounded by walls covered in symbols, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The symbols pulsed, as though they were alive, feeding off the fear that coursed through my veins. The whispers began then, low and guttural, echoing all around me. The offering they chanted, their voices melding into one. It wasn't just the walls whispering, it was the house itself, as if the manor had become a living, breathing entity, hungering for my soul. Desperate to escape, I clawed at the walls, my fingers scraping against the rough stone until they bled. The symbols seemed to shift under my touch, almost as if mocking my attempt to break free. Panic surged through me, and I forced myself to search the chamber for any sign of a way out. In the far corner, I saw a small door, nearly invisible in the dim light. With every ounce of strength I had left, I threw myself at the door, wrenching it open. I found myself in a narrow passageway, its walls lined with portraits of past guests, faces twisted in horror, their eyes wide with the knowledge of their doom. Each one seemed to scream silently at me, as if begging me to take their place and let them go free. Behind me, the chanting grew louder, more insistent, the words clawing at my mind. I knew they were coming for me, that I was running out of time. The faces in the portraits seemed to watch me, their eyes following my every movement, urging me to hurry. I reached the end of the passage, the massive iron door standing in my way, marked with the same symbol that was on the wax seal of the invitation. In a moment of clarity, I ripped the wax seal from my pocket and pressed it into the keyhole. The door shuddered and then miraculously swung open. I stumbled out into the cold night air, my breath fogging in the chill. I ran, my legs pumping with adrenaline, my heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat of survival. The manor's windows blazed with that unnatural green light, and I could feel the eyes of those within following me, their whispers carried on the wind. You cannot escape, they seemed to say. You belong to us now. As I reached the edge of the manor's grounds, I dared to look back just once. The manor stood silently against the night sky, its windows glowing like eyes in the darkness. And in those windows I saw them, the guests, their faces no longer masked, but twisted into grotesque shapes, watching me with eyes that burned with an unholy light. In that moment, I understood. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, Willowcrest Manor would follow me. I was marked, and the shadows of that cursed house would forever linger in my life, a dark stain on my soul. And I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that this was only the beginning. Story 9: The Smiling Reflection. The sunlight streamed through my bedroom window, casting a soft, golden hue across the room. I stretched lazily, savoring the warmth that crept over my body and the peaceful quiet of the morning. It was the kind of morning that made you feel like everything was in its place, a day just beginning with the comfort of a familiar routine. I dragged myself out of bed, yawning, and shuffled to the bathroom. The sleep was still clinging to me, and all I wanted was to splash cold water on my face and wake up fully. I flicked on the bathroom light, the sudden brightness making me squint for a moment. As I leaned over the sink and splashed the cool water on my face, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. At first, everything seemed as it should: my hair a mess, my eyes still slightly puffy with sleep, and my skin pale from the cool morning air. But then, something in my reflection caught my attention. I froze, my hands still wet, drops of water clinging to my fingertips. My reflection me was smiling. It wasn't the kind of smile you absent-mindedly give yourself when you're in a good mood. It was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across my face like some grotesque parody of joy. My heart thudded in my chest as I stood there, staring, unable to move. My lips hadn't moved, but the reflection in the mirror was grinning back at me, its eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place, something dark. I blinked, stepping back from the sink, my heart pounding in my chest. I must be seeing things. It had to be a trick of the light, or the remnants of a strange dream I hadn't fully shaken off. But the reflection didn't change. It kept smiling that awful, toothy grin, the corners of its mouth stretching almost to its ears. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath, my voice shaky. I turned away from the mirror, closing my eyes and taking a few deep breaths. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe this was some weird after effect of not getting enough sleep. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the feeling of wrongness crept up my spine, prickling my skin. After a moment, I forced myself to look back at the mirror, hoping, praying that my reflection would be normal again. But no, the grin was still there, wider now, if that was even possible. My reflection's eyes were locked on mine, but they didn't look like my eyes. They were too bright, too full of something sinister. I could feel my stomach twisting in knots, and my hands started to tremble. This wasn't normal. I had no explanation for it, but I knew something was very, very wrong. I reached up to touch my face, trying to force myself to smile to mimic what I was seeing in the mirror. Maybe that would make it stop. Maybe I just needed to align myself with what I was seeing. But my lips didn't move. They stayed firmly in place, frozen in a horrified, half-parted expression, while my reflection continued to smile back at me with that eerie, unnatural grin. Fear shot through me, cold and sharp. I took a step back from the mirror, nearly tripping over the bath mat. My heart was hammering in my chest now, and I could feel sweat beginning to beat at my temples. I needed to get out of the bathroom. I needed to get away from whatever was happening, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I couldn't stop staring at the reflection, at that monstrous smile that wasn't mine but somehow was. My thoughts raced, trying to find some explanation, some logical reason for this, but none came. Then, as if to make things worse, the reflection began to move. It raised its hand, my hand, but I hadn't moved. It touched the side of its face, still smiling, as if mocking me. My stomach flipped. I watched, paralyzed, as it reached forward, pressing its palm flat against the other side of the mirror, as if it were trying to push through. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, crashing into the bathroom door. I fumbled for the doorknob, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly grasp it. I had to get out, I had to leave. I finally yanked the door open and rushed out into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind was spinning. The image of that horrifying grin burned into my brain. What the hell had just happened? By reflection, no, that thing had moved on its own. That wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to convince myself that I was awake, that this wasn't some nightmare I hadn't yet woken up from. I could feel the coolness of my skin, the rapid thudding of my heartbeat beneath my fingers. This was real. It had to be real. But then what? What was happening to me? I paced the hallway, my mind racing. I needed answers. I couldn't just ignore this. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. But who could I tell? What could I even say? Hey, my reflection's grinning at me like a lunatic. That didn't exactly sound sane. I grabbed my phone off the kitchen counter, my hands still shaking as I dialed Sarah's number. She'd think I was crazy, but I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. The phone rang once, twice, and then her groggy voice answered, "Hello." "Sarah, I need you to come over," I said, my voice coming out faster and more frantic than I had intended. Good morning to you too," she replied, the confusion in her voice clear. "What's going on?" "I can't explain it over the phone. Just come over, okay? Please, I need you to see something." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her trying to figure out if I was serious or if this was some weird prank. Finally, she sighed. "All right, I'll be there in 10. But this better not be some joke, or I swear." "It's not a joke," I interrupted. "Just hurry." I hung up, my heart still pounding in my chest. 10 minutes. I just had to hold it together for 10 more minutes. I could hear the faint sound of the bathroom light still buzzing from behind the closed door, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I didn't want to see whatever was in that mirror again, not alone. I sat on the couch, my legs bouncing nervously as I waited for Sarah to arrive. The silence in the house was deafening. Every creak, every rustle made my skin crawl. What if I had imagined it? What if, by the time Sarah got here, everything was back to normal and I just looked like a complete lunatic? But then I remembered that smile, that horrible, stretched grin. I hadn't imagined that. I couldn't have. The doorbell rang and I jumped, my nerves on edge. I rushed to the door, pulling it open to see Sarah standing there, still in her pajamas, her hair a messy bun on top of her head. "All right, what's so urgent that you're dragging me out of bed?" She glanced at her phone. 8 in the morning. "Just come inside," I said, stepping aside to let her in. She raised an eyebrow but followed me into the house. I led her straight to the bathroom door, my hand hovering over the knob for a moment before I finally turned it and pushed the door open. Sarah peered into the bathroom, then glanced back at me. What exactly am I supposed to be seeing here? I swallowed, my throat dry. The mirror. Look at the mirror. She turned back to the bathroom, stepping inside and facing the mirror. For a long moment, nothing happened. It was just her reflection staring back at her normal. I felt a wave of doubt crash over me. Was I going crazy? "Okay, seriously, what's going on? Did you have a bad dream or something?" she asked, turning to face me, her brow furrowed. "No, I swear it was." It was smiling at me. It wasn't me, but it was. "Okay, slow down," she said, stepping out of the bathroom. "You're freaking me out. Are you sure you weren't just half asleep or something? Maybe you imagined it." "I didn't imagine it. I snapped, my frustration boiling over. It was real. It moved on its own. It wasn't me. Sarah looked at me, her expression softening. Hey, look, maybe you're just stressed, okay? It happens. I've had weird dreams where I thought something was real, but it wasn't. You're probably just overworked. I wanted to argue, to insist that what I had seen was real, but the words caught in my throat. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Sarah sighed, pulling me into a hug. Get some rest, all right? I think you're just exhausted. If you keep freaking out, call me again. But I really think you're just stressed. I nodded, though I didn't believe a word of it. After she left, I sat on the couch, staring at the bathroom door. The doubt was gnawing at me, but so was the fear. I couldn't go back in there. I couldn't look at that mirror again, not after what I'd seen. That night I tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile, that awful twisted grin. I kept imagining it in the darkness, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to look again. The house felt different now, as if the air itself had changed, thick with something I couldn't explain. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it. Laughter. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It came from the bathroom. My heart raced, and I sat up in bed, listening. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the walls. I knew, without a doubt, that the reflection was waiting for me. And this time, it wasn't just smiling. Story 10, the basement laughter. The old house creaked as the sun began its slow descent beyond the horizon, casting long, stretching shadows across the hardwood floor. The dying light filtered through the windows in fractured patterns, distorted by the heavy, ancient curtains that had hung there for God knows how long. It had been only a few months since I moved in, and despite the charm and rustic feel, I couldn't shake a lingering unease about one part of the house, the basement. From the moment I first toured the house, the basement had bothered me. The rest of the house felt lived in, almost cozy, with its worn furniture and faded wallpaper. It was the kind of place that had clearly been cared for, even if its best years were behind it. But the basement was different. It was dim, cluttered, and had the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of a place long forgotten. The air down there always felt thick and damp, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I remember the real estate agent being quick to move past the basement door during the house tour, almost as if she was hoping I wouldn't ask to go down there. She laughed awkwardly, mentioning something about old basements and character. I shrugged it off at the time, thinking it was just the typical mustiness of a century-old house. But after I moved in, that unease never left. At first I ignored it. There were plenty of things that needed my attention on the main floor, and upstairs the house was old, and every day seemed to bring some new small repair or quirk that needed tending to. The basement could wait. I had stored a few boxes down there after the move, but I rarely ventured below the first few steps. The dim bulb hanging from the ceiling barely lit the space, and the shadows seemed to stretch out in every direction, filling the room with an unsettling sense of being watched. Then, one evening, the laughter began. I was sitting in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book and a mug of tea, savoring the quiet. The house had a peaceful stillness at night, the kind that made you feel like you were alone in the world, disconnected from the chaos outside. I was just beginning to lose myself in the pages when I heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle. It sounded like the laughter of a child, echoing faintly through the house. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. For a moment, I wondered if it had been my imagination. The house was old, after all, and old houses had a way of playing tricks on you, making you hear things that weren't really there. But then it came again, louder this time, clearer. A child's laughter floating up from the basement. My heart leapt into my throat as I stared toward the basement door, which stood slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. A thin strip of darkness stretched out from behind it, spilling onto the floor like a creeping shadow. I hadn't heard it before, but now that I was listening, I could just make out the faintest sound of tiny footsteps, as if someone was moving down there. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm. This was impossible. I was the only one in the house. No one else had a key, and no children had ever lived here, at least not according to the real estate agent. It had been owned by an older couple who had passed away, leaving it empty for years. There was no reason, no explanation for the sound. I stood up slowly, my muscles tense with fear and uncertainty, and took a step toward the basement door. The laughter came again, softer now, as if the source of it was moving deeper into the shadows below. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I hesitated, my feet glued to the floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, my throat tight. There was no answer, just silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and for a moment, I thought maybe it had stopped. But then, like a cruel joke, the laughter returned, echoing up from the basement once more, louder than before. It wasn't playful anymore. There was something twisted about it now, something mocking. It sent a jolt of terror through me, and I stumbled back, knocking into the side table. The noise snapped me out of my trance, and I grabbed the flashlight from the table drawer, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the dim light of the hallway, landing on the basement door. The laughter had stopped again, leaving only an oppressive silence in its wake. But I knew that if I opened that door, if I went down into that basement, I would find something waiting for me, something I wasn't prepared for. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of the house and never come back. But I couldn't. This was my home now, and I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. Not yet. Not until I knew for sure what I was dealing with. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the doorknob and pulled the basement door fully open. The smell of stale air and musty wood hit me immediately, and the sound of the creaking hinges echoed down the narrow staircase. I shined the flashlight down the steps, but the beam only pierced the first few feet of darkness. The rest of the basement remained hidden in shadow, as if it were swallowing the light whole. I swallowed hard and stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned under my weight, and I hesitated, gripping the railing tightly. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. But I couldn't stop now, not when I was so close. "Hello," I called again, my voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone down there?" Nothing, just silence. I waited, listening, but the laughter didn't come this time. I forced myself down another step, then another. The basement seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer with each step. The flashlight flickered, casting long, twisting shadows along the walls. I could just make out the shapes of the old furniture, the forgotten boxes, and the rusted tools that littered the space. And then, in the corner, I saw it. A small, cracked mirror leaned against the far wall, its surface covered in dust. It looked out of place, almost too pristine compared to the rest of the clutter in the basement. I stepped closer, shining the flashlight over it, trying to get a better look. That's when I saw something just for a second, a glimpse of movement in the reflection. I turned sharply, my flashlight scanning the room, but there was nothing there, just the empty basement. I looked back at the mirror, my pulse quickening. In its dusty surface, I could see myself, pale and wide-eyed, the flashlight in my trembling hand. But behind me, in the far corner of the room, something else moved. A shadow, a small figure. And then I heard it again. The laughter. It was right behind me now. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the basement was empty. My breath came in, ragged gasps as I scanned the room, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. There was no one there, but I knew what I had heard. I wasn't imagining this. I couldn't be. My gaze flicked back to the mirror, and my stomach dropped. The figure was still there, standing in the corner of the reflection, watching me. A small child, barely visible in the dim light, her face obscured by shadow. But I could see her smile wide and twisted, like the grin of something that didn't belong in this world. I stumbled backward, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, the beam swinging wildly as it rolled across the ground. In the darkness, I could still hear the faint sound of that twisted, mocking laughter, echoing in the corners of the basement, growing louder and louder until it filled the entire space. I ran. I didn't think I just ran, scrambling up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me. The laughter followed me, growing more distorted, more menacing with every step. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, collapsing against it, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. The house was silent again. The laughter had stopped the moment I shut the door, but I could still hear it in my head, echoing like a twisted memory, replaying over and over. I sat there for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the door, too afraid to move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no explanation, nothing that made any rational sense. All I knew was that something was down there, something that didn't want me in its space. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring at the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps or laughter to start up again. But the house remained quiet, and eventually the tension in my chest began to ease. I tried to tell myself it was over, that whatever I had heard or seen was gone. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. Over the next few days, I avoided the basement. I locked the door, kept it shut tight, and tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind. But the house felt different now. Every creak, every groan of the old wood made my skin crawl. I could feel that something was watching me, waiting. I started hearing the laughter again at night, faint, distant, but unmistakable. It would drift up through the floorboards as I lay in bed, or echo through the house while I sat in the living room, pretending to read. I knew it was coming from the basement, but I couldn't bring myself to go back down there. And then, one night, I heard something worse. It wasn't just laughter this time. It was a voice, a soft, childlike voice, calling out from the darkness. Come play with me. Story 11, The Haunting Phone Call. The accident happened on a rainy Thursday evening. The kind of night where the sky is a blanket of gray and the roads shine slick with rain, making every car feel like it's skating across a thin layer of oil. I was driving home from work, my mind buzzing with the mundane events of the day, an exhausting meeting, endless emails, a snarky comment from my boss that I couldn't seem to shake. My windshield wipers worked furiously to keep the rain at bay, but the visibility was terrible. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, headlights flashed directly in front of me, blindingly close. My heart leaped into my throat. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the wet pavement. But it was too late. The impact was violent. Metal crunched against metal, the sound of shattering glass filled the air. My body jolted forward, the seatbelt digging into my chest, and for a split second, everything was chaos and explosion of noise and fear. When it was over, there was only silence, punctuated by the steady patter of rain against the wreckage. I sat there, stunned, my hands still gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled terror. My chest ached from the impact, my head throbbed, and I could taste blood on my lips. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I just sat there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. Then, slowly, I turned to look at the other car. It had veered into the oncoming lane, slamming into my vehicle head-on. The front of the car was a twisted mess of metal and glass, the rainwater running down its shattered windshield in rivulets. Through the haze of rain and darkness, I could just make out the shape of a figure slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. My heart skipped a beat. I fumbled with my seatbelt, my hands shaking, and forced the door open. The rain hit me like a wall, soaking my clothes instantly, but I didn't care. I stumbled toward the other car, my legs weak, my mind still reeling from the crash. "Hey," I shouted, my voice hoarse, barely audible over the rain. "Are you okay?" There was no response. I reached the driver's side door and peered in, my heart sinking. The man behind the wheel couldn't have been more than 25, maybe younger. His dark hair was matted with blood, his face pale, his chest unmoving. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel, but I knew, just by looking at him, that he was gone. A cold wave of shock rolled over me. I don't remember much after that. The paramedics arrived quickly, pulling me away from the wreckage, their voices a blur in the chaos. They examined me, checked for broken bones, but other than a few cuts and bruises, I was physically okay. Emotionally, though, I was shattered. The young man in the other car, his name was Alex, they said had died on impact. He never stood a chance. A knot of guilt twisted in my gut as I watched them pull his body from the wreckage, covering him with a sheet before loading him into the ambulance. It wasn't my fault, they told me. The roads were slick, and Alex had swerved into my lane. But the knowledge didn't help. I'd been involved in his death. His life was over, and I was still here, standing in the rain, trying to make sense of the senseless. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the accident. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face pale, lifeless, slumped over the wheel. The image haunted me, and no amount of distraction could chase it away. Even in my waking hours, I could hear the sound of the crash echoing in my ears, the sickening crunch of metal, the sharp shatter of glass. It was a sound I couldn't escape. I started seeing a therapist, hoping she could help me sort through the mess of guilt and trauma that had taken root in my chest. She told me it would take time, that these things didn't heal overnight. But I wasn't sure I wanted them to heal. A part of me felt like I deserved this guilt, that I should carry it with me for the rest of my life. And then the phone calls began. It started a few weeks after the accident. I was sitting at home, curled up on the couch, trying to lose myself in a mindless TV show, when my phone rang. It was late after midnight, and the number on the screen was unfamiliar. I stared at it for a moment, my heart suddenly racing. For some reason, I didn't want to answer it. Something about the timing, the unknown number, made my skin crawl. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Hello, I said, my voice tentative. There was silence on the other end. I could hear the faint hum of static, the kind of crackling noise that you sometimes get with a bad connection. For a moment, I thought maybe the call had been a mistake, someone dialing the wrong number. I was about to hang up when a voice spoke. You need to listen. I froze, the phone suddenly cold against my ear. The voice was low, raspy, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. My blood ran cold. It was Alex. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a long moment I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't possible. Alex was dead. I had seen his body, seen them take him away. This had to be a prank. Someone was messing with me. That was the only explanation. I hung up, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the phone. I sat there in the dark, staring at the screen, waiting for it to ring again, but it didn't. I told myself it was a sick joke, a cruel prank by someone who had heard about the accident. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next day, I couldn't shake the call from my mind. The voice, the way it had said, "You need to listen," it had been so distinct, so real. It wasn't just a random phrase. It was a command, and it sounded exactly like him. The following night, the phone rang again. This time I hesitated before answering, my fingers hovering over the screen. I didn't want to hear it again. I didn't want to hear his voice. But something inside me, a morbid curiosity, perhaps made me answer. Hello, I said, my voice barely a whisper. There was the same crackling static, the same ominous silence. And then the voice came again. You need to listen. I felt the blood drain from my face. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Who is this? I stammered, my voice shaking. The static crackled for a moment, and then the voice whispered, "You know who I am." I hung up, my heart racing, and immediately blocked the number. I couldn't deal with this. I couldn't hear his voice again. Not when it sent chills down my spine. Not when it stirred something deep inside me, a fear I couldn't explain. But blocking the number didn't help. The calls continued, always from different numbers, always at the same time, just after midnight. And every time, the voice said the same thing. You need to listen. It haunted me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the calls. I started keeping my phone off at night, hoping that would stop it, but the moment I turned it back on, there would be missed calls, voicemails, all saying the same thing. You need to listen. I finally confided in my therapist, desperate for an explanation, for anything that could make sense of what was happening. She listened patiently as I described the calls, the voice, and the eerie, unshakable feeling that it really was Alex, reaching out from beyond the grave. She suggested that maybe my guilt was manifesting in these calls, that my mind was creating these experiences as a way to process the trauma of the accident. She told me to answer the calls, to confront whatever I was afraid of, and maybe, just maybe, that would help me find closure. I didn't want to. I was terrified of hearing his voice again. But the calls weren't stopping, and I knew she was right. I couldn't avoid this forever. The next time the phone rang, just after midnight, I answered. Hello, I said, my voice trembling. The static buzzed in my ear for a moment, and then the voice came again, soft, almost pleading this time. You need to listen. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. Listen to what? There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought the call had ended. But then, the voice spoke again. It wasn't your fault. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just heard. "You were in the wrong place," the voice continued, "at the wrong time. But it wasn't your fault." Tears welled up in my eyes. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me lightheaded, dizzy. "Alex," I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was another long pause, and then the voice softened, the static fading slightly. "You need to let go." The words cut through me, sharp and painful, and I realized I was shaking, my hands trembling as I gripped the phone. I had been carrying this guilt, this unbearable weight, ever since the accident, and now he was telling me to let go. "I'm sorry," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, for the first time, the voice seemed to lose its cold, mechanical edge. It sounded human. It sounded real. "I know," it whispered. "But you need to move on. You can't carry this forever." I closed my eyes, letting the tears fall. For the first time since the accident, I felt something inside me begin to crack, to give way. The walls I had built around my guilt, my grief, were starting to crumble. "Goodbye," the voice said, so soft I almost didn't hear it. And then the line went dead. I sat there in the dark, the phone still clutched in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt still, almost peaceful, as if a weight had been lifted from the air. I never got another call after that. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly that night, free from the haunting whispers of guilt and the relentless echo of his voice. Alex was gone, and finally, so was the guilt. I had always loved the mountains. Something about the towering peaks, the crisp air, and the vast expanse of wilderness made me feel like I could breathe easier. The world was simpler up there, quieter, more peaceful. That's why I decided to spend the weekend hiking solo in the remote highlands of a national park. It was a bit of a drive, but I didn't mind. I wanted to be alone, to leave behind the daily grind and just lose myself in the serenity of nature. The trail I chose was relatively unknown, not marked on the official park maps. I had found it on an old forum for experienced hikers who sought solitude and adventure. It was challenging but rewarding, and most importantly, far from the crowds that typically populated more popular trails. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon. The sun was already low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the mountains. There were no other cars in the small gravel lot, which was exactly what I had hoped for. I grabbed my pack, double-checked my gear, and set out, eager to reach a good spot to camp before nightfall. The trail was tough, just as I expected, winding through dense forests and steep inclines. I hiked steadily for a few hours, watching the sun dip lower behind the mountain peaks, until I reached a small plateau with a stunning view of the valley below. It was the perfect spot to set up camp, isolated, quiet, and with an incredible vantage point to watch the sunset. I set up my tent quickly, the fading light signaling the fast approaching night. Once my camp was ready, I sat on a rock near the edge of the plateau, sipping water and taking in the breathtaking view. The sun had nearly disappeared, leaving the sky streaked with brilliant colors, deep oranges, purples, and pinks. The air was cool and fresh, and for the first time in what felt like months, I felt at peace. As the stars began to twinkle above, I lit a small fire, its warm glow illuminating the rocky ground around me. I wasn't planning on staying up too late. I had an early start planned for the next day to explore more of the rugged terrain. But for now, I was content just sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. That's when I noticed the lights. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable against the backdrop of the darkening sky. Just a few small, flickering pinpricks of light, far off in the distance, at the base of the mountain. I squinted, leaning forward to get a better look, but they were so far away that I couldn't make out much detail. Maybe they were from a distant town, or from other hikers far below. The lights blinked and shimmered in a way that was almost hypnotic. I shrugged it off, figuring it was nothing unusual, and returned my attention to the fire. But as the minutes passed, the lights began to move. I froze, watching as the faint glimmers of light slowly shifted, moving in a deliberate pattern. They weren't stationary anymore. They were rising, climbing the mountain, making their way toward me. My first thought was that they were other hikers, maybe with headlamps or flashlights, making their way up the same trail I had taken. But something about the way the lights moved didn't seem right. They were too smooth, too fluid, like they were floating rather than bouncing with the rhythm of walking. A knot of unease began to form in my stomach. I stood up, walking closer to the edge of the plateau, my eyes fixed on the lights as they continued their steady ascent. There were more of them now, at least 5 or 6, flickering softly in the distance, getting closer by the minute. I glanced down the trail, half expecting to see other campers or hikers emerging from the trees. But the path behind me was empty, and the forest was eerily silent. No footsteps, no voices. Just the soft crackle of my fire and the distant hum of the wind. The lights kept climbing. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack and flicked it on, shining the beam down the trail. The powerful light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rocky path below, but there was nothing. No movement, no hikers, just the empty trail stretching down into the darkness. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. Something wasn't right. These weren't other hikers. I could feel it in my gut. I stood there for a few more moments, staring at the lights as they continued to rise, now less than a mile away. They were moving faster now, too fast for anyone on foot. And they were too high in the air, floating above the ground, weaving through the trees, as if they weren't bound by the laws of gravity. Panic began to creep in, my mind racing with possibilities. Were they drones? But why would anyone be flying drones out here, in the middle of the night, so far from civilization? I turned off my flashlight and backed away from the edge, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire crackled behind me, but its warmth no longer felt comforting. I couldn't take my eyes off the lights. They were getting closer, how much closer. Within minutes, they were only a few hundred feet away, just beyond the tree line that bordered the plateau. I could see them clearly now, 6 or 7 pale orbs of light, floating silently through the trees. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, hovering effortlessly, their glow faint but steady. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The lights stopped. They hovered just at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 feet away, flickering softly like fireflies. But these weren't fireflies. They were too large, too deliberate in their movements. They didn't blink or dart around randomly. They just waited. I stood frozen, staring at the lights, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. I had no explanation, no logical reason for why these lights were here or what they were. I thought about calling out, shouting into the darkness to see if there was anyone behind the lights, some person controlling them, playing a prank, anything. But the fear kept my mouth shut. My instincts were screaming at me to stay silent, to stay still. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights began to move again. But this time, they weren't moving up the mountain. They were moving toward me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a rock. The lights floated forward, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us. My mind raced, searching for some kind of plan, some way to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with fear. The lights were only 20 feet away now, their glow casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, my skin prickling with a strange, electric sensation. I backed up further, my hands trembling, until I felt the heat of the fire at my back. The flames flickered weakly, as if they were being smothered by the presence of the lights. 15 feet. 10 feet. They were almost on top of me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, just as they reached the edge of the clearing, the lights stopped. They hovered there, silent and motionless, their soft glow illuminating the rocks and trees around me. I could see them clearly now, perfectly round orbs of light, each one about the size of a basketball, floating in midair without any visible source or origin. They didn't move. They didn't flicker. They just watched. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the lights, my heart pounding in my chest. Time seemed to stretch out, the world narrowing down to just me and these strange, impossible orbs. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the lights began to fade. One by one, they dimmed, their glow flickering softly before winking out of existence. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving nothing but darkness in their wake. I stood there, breathless, staring at the spot where the lights had been, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The forest was silent again, the only sound the soft crackle of the dying fire behind me. I waited, half expecting the lights to return, to reappear from the shadows and resume their slow, deliberate approach. But they didn't. The darkness remained still and empty. After what felt like hours, I finally moved. I stumbled back to my tent, my hands shaking as I unzipped the flap and crawled inside. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning with 1,000 unanswered questions. I lay there, curled up in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence outside, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The night passed in a blur of fear and sleeplessness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through me, but the lights never returned. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't bother with breakfast or taking in the view. I just grabbed my gear, threw it into my pack, and hiked down the mountain as fast as I could. I never told anyone about the lights. What could I say? That I had been visited by floating orbs of light in the middle of the night, miles from civilization. No one would believe me. Hell, I wasn't even sure if I believed it myself. But I know what I saw. And I haven't been back to that mountain since. Camping had always been my way of clearing my head. The woods were my escape from the chaos of everyday life. No emails, no phone calls, just me and the quiet serenity of nature. I usually went with a friend or two, but this time I was alone. It had been a rough few weeks at work, and I needed the solitude to regroup. I had planned a solo weekend trip to a remote spot I had visited a few times before, about 5 miles from the nearest trailhead. It was isolated, quiet and the perfect place to be alone with my thoughts. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, parked my car, and started the hike. The trail was narrow and wound its way through thick woods, with the occasional break in the trees offering glimpses of the mountains in the distance. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. It felt good to be back in nature, away from the constant noise of the city. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. I quickly set up my tent and gathered some firewood, eager to get a fire going before nightfall. The campsite was perfect, completely secluded, with a small stream nearby and a thick wall of trees surrounding the clearing. As the fire crackled to life, I sat back on a log, sipping water from my canteen and letting the warmth of the flames seep into my skin. The sky above had turned a deep purple, the first stars beginning to twinkle against the fading light. Everything was calm. Everything felt right. But then, as the darkness began to settle in, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't immediate. At first, it was just a vague unease, a feeling that something was off. I glanced around the clearing, but there was nothing, just the trees standing tall and still, their shadows stretching long across the forest floor. I told myself I was being paranoid. It wasn't unusual to feel a little on edge when you were camping alone, especially as night fell. The isolation played tricks on your mind. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. I poked at the fire, trying to shake off the sense of unease. But every time I looked into the trees, I felt like I was missing something. Like there was someone just out of sight, hiding in the shadows, watching me. I told myself it was nothing. There was no one out here but me. But that didn't stop the prickling feeling at the back of my neck, the constant sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. It wasn't until I heard the snap of a twig that my heart leapt into my throat. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the sound echoed through the quiet night. It had come from just beyond the edge of the clearing, from the thick cluster of trees directly in front of me. I strained my ears, listening, but the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animals moving through the brush. Just the soft crackle of the fire and the thudding of my own heartbeat in my ears. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. No answer. Just the stillness of the night. I stood up slowly, grabbing my flashlight from my pack, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had heard the sound. My hands were shaking slightly as I flicked the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the trees. Nothing. I swept the light back and forth, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but the forest was empty. No figure hiding in the shadows, no animal darting between the trees, just nothing. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon, something moving through the brush. Nothing to worry about. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I sat back down by the fire, my body tense, my ears straining to pick up any other sounds. The forest was unnervingly quiet now, the usual night sounds of the woods absent. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. As the minutes ticked by, I began to relax just a little. I hadn't heard anything else, and the figure I had been imagining in the trees hadn't appeared. I told myself I was being silly, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, just as I was beginning to settle back into my seat, I saw it. At the very edge of the firelight, just beyond the reach of the flames, a figure stood, motionless. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the figure didn't move. It was tall, at least 6 feet, and shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out any features, but it was unmistakably human, standing just outside the clearing, watching me. I froze, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. Who was this? How had they gotten so close without me noticing? And why were they just standing there? "Hello," I called out again, my voice trembling. No response. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as still as the trees around it. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stood up slowly, my hand gripping the flashlight. I flicked it on and aimed it directly at the figure, the beam cutting through the darkness. But when the light hit the spot where the figure had been, it was gone. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the tree line. The figure had vanished, disappeared without a sound. One moment it had been there, and the next it was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting back and forth, searching the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No sound, no rustling leaves, no footsteps. Just the empty forest and the faint crackle of the fire behind me. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Was my brain playing tricks on me? It didn't seem possible. I had seen it. I had felt that something had been standing there. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing heart. There was no way I was imagining this. I had seen something, but what? I slowly backed up to the fire, my eyes never leaving the tree line, and sat down, my flashlight still clutched tightly in my hand. My body was tense, every muscle on edge, waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. For hours I sat there, staring into the darkness, the fire slowly dying down to embers. The figure never reappeared, and the forest remained eerily silent. Eventually, exhaustion began to creep in. My body was drained from the tension, and my eyes grew heavy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that whatever had been standing at the edge of the clearing was still out there, waiting. I glanced at my tent, debating whether I should try to sleep. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to hike back to the car in the dead of night and forget this trip had ever happened. But another part of me, the rational part, told me to stay. It was probably nothing. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe my mind, tired from the stress of the last few weeks, was playing tricks on me. I finally decided to crawl into my tent, though I kept the flashlight beside me, my hand resting on it just in case. I zipped the tent flap tightly shut and lay there, my eyes wide open, listening to the silence outside. Hours passed. The fire died completely, leaving the clearing in total darkness. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl broke the stillness. But there were no more footsteps, no more figures at the edge of the camp. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to the first light of dawn filtering through the tent fabric. My body ached from the tension of the night before, and my mind was still fuzzy from lack of sleep. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes and glancing around the tent. Everything was where I had left it, my pack, my gear, the flashlight. Everything was normal. But as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, a wave of unease washed over me. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, except for one thing. At the edge of the clearing, where the figure had been standing, there were footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the soft earth, but they were there, clear, unmistakable footprints leading into the woods. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Someone had been there. I hadn't imagined it. I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my backpack. I didn't care about breakfast or enjoying the sunrise. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. Who or what had been watching me? Why hadn't they approached or said anything? And why had they disappeared without a trace, only to leave those footprints behind? By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. I threw my pack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. I haven't been back to that campsite since. I don't know who or what was out there that night, watching me from the edge of the camp. But I do know one thing: I wasn't alone. And whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. I had always found peace in the woods. Something about the isolation, the silence, and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees had a calming effect on me. So after a particularly grueling month at work, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I didn't want to deal with crowded campgrounds or noisy tourists. I wanted true solitude. So I picked a remote spot in the mountains, far off the beaten path, miles from the nearest road. The drive to the trailhead took most of the day, but I didn't mind. The winding roads through the mountains were beautiful, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape, I felt my stress melt away. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and I was eager to get started on the hike. I grabbed my gear, locked the car, and set off into the woods. The trail was narrow, barely more than a faint path through the trees, but I had a map and knew the area well enough. The campsite I had in mind was about 2 hours in a small clearing by a creek, surrounded by towering pines. I'd camped there once before, years ago, and remembered it being the perfect spot for a quiet, peaceful night under the stars. The hike was uneventful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. As I walked, the sun continued to sink lower, the light filtering through the trees in long golden beams. It was the kind of peaceful setting I had been craving, and by the time I reached the clearing, I felt like I had left the stress of the world behind. The campsite looked exactly as I remembered it: an open space surrounded by dense forest, with a small stream trickling nearby. I set up my tent quickly, eager to relax before it got dark. Once the tent was up, I gathered some firewood and got a small fire going, the warmth of the flames pushing back the growing chill in the air. I sat by the fire, eating a simple dinner and watching the last light of the day fade from the sky. The stars began to twinkle overhead, and the forest grew darker, the trees looming tall and still around me. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of the creek. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to creep in. It was subtle at first, a vague unease, like something was just off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I sat there staring into the fire, the more the feeling grew. The woods around me, which had felt peaceful and serene only moments ago, now felt oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more intense. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I had been looking forward to this solitude for weeks, of course. I wasn't used to it. But as I stared into the fire, that uneasy feeling continued to grow, settling like a weight in my chest. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the creek. But as I sat there, listening, the sound grew louder. It was a rhythmic thumping, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I froze, straining to hear. The sound was faint, distant, but it was definitely there. A steady, deliberate thump, like something or someone was moving through the trees. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too slow, too heavy. My heart began to race as I tried to pinpoint the source of the noise, but the forest was too thick, too dark. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight from my pack, and shone the beam into the woods. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing. Just the thick trunks and tangled branches, stretching out into the shadows. But the sound continued. Thump. Thump. It was closer now, still distant, but unmistakable. The rhythmic pounding echoed through the still night air, sending a shiver down my spine. I swept the flashlight back and forth, scanning the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. Just the steady thump, 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 like something large and heavy was making its way through the woods. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an echo or a tree falling somewhere in the distance. But the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It wasn't random. It was moving. Closer. I backed up toward the fire, my eyes fixed on the tree line, every muscle in my body tense. The flashlight beam flickered slightly, the batteries beginning to wear down, but I didn't turn it off. I couldn't. The sound was getting louder, closer, and I needed to see what was coming. Thump. 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 It was coming from the left now, just beyond the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone the flashlight toward the sound, but the trees were so thick I couldn't see anything beyond the first few rows of trunks. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence. I stood there, frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest was completely still again, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of the creek. The rhythmic pounding was gone, as if it had never been there. But I knew what I had heard, something someone had been moving through the woods. I waited listening, my ears straining for any sign of the sound returning. But there was nothing, just the silence of the night. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly lowered the flashlight and sat back down by the fire, my heart still racing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had been hearing things, maybe the isolation was getting to me. It had been a long hike, and I was tired. That had to be it. But as I sat there staring into the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hiding in the trees, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat by the fire until the flames died down to embers, my eyes constantly darting to the edge of the clearing, scanning for any sign of movement. The rhythmic thumping didn't return, but the feeling of being watched never left. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap tightly shut. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence outside, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending a jolt of fear through me. But the night passed without incident, and when the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, blinking in the early morning light. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, the fire reduced to ashes, the creek still babbling softly nearby. Everything was normal, peaceful. But as I packed up my gear, ready to head back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching, waiting. The hike back to the car was uneventful. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the forest felt alive again. The unease I had felt during the night began to fade, replaced by the familiar comfort of being outdoors. By the time I reached the car, I had almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been a product of my overactive imagination. But as I loaded my gear into the trunk and prepared to leave, I heard it again. That sound. Thump. 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 It was distant, faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind in the trees. But it was there. I stood still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound didn't get any closer this time, didn't move toward me. It just lingered, faint, rhythmic. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I climbed into the car, slammed the door shut, and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The sound faded as I sped down the gravel road, but the unease remained. I haven't been back to that campsite since. I don't know what caused that sound, and I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that something was out there moving through the woods, watching me. And the next time I camp alone, I'll make sure it's nowhere near that place. The old cabin had been a family secret for as long as I could remember. My grandfather had built it decades ago, deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, far from any towns or roads. It wasn't listed on any maps, and the only way to get there was by hiking miles through dense forest. Growing up, my family would visit the cabin for long weekends or summer breaks, but as the years went on and life got busier, the trips became less frequent. By the time I was in my 20s, the cabin had been mostly forgotten. My parents hadn't mentioned it in years, and I had almost forgotten about it myself until I found the old key in my grandfather's belongings after he passed away. Holding that key, I felt an odd pull to visit the place again. It had been years since I had last seen the cabin, and the thought of spending a few quiet days in the woods sounded appealing. Life had been stressful lately, and I needed the escape. So I packed my gear, grabbed a map from an old hiking guide my grandfather had written, and set off to find the cabin. The drive took most of the day, winding through the mountains on roads that grew narrower and more rugged the further I went. By the time I parked at the edge of the forest, it was late afternoon, the sun already beginning to sink behind the treetops. I grabbed my pack and the old key, locked the car, and started the long hike to the cabin. The trail was overgrown, barely recognizable in some places, but I managed to follow the route my grandfather had marked on the map. The forest was dense and quiet, the trees towering overhead and blocking most of the sunlight. I hadn't seen another person in hours, and I didn't expect this was one of the most remote parts of the state, miles from any towns or hiking trails. That was part of the cabin's appeal. It was a place where you could truly be alone. As I walked, memories of the cabin came flooding back. Summer afternoons spent fishing in the nearby creek, evenings by the fire with my family, and the comforting smell of pine that always seemed to linger in the air. I hadn't been back in nearly a decade, but it all felt familiar, like stepping into a forgotten chapter of my life. After about 2 hours of hiking, I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked just as I remembered it, small, rustic, with a weathered wood exterior and a stone chimney that rose high above the roof. The windows were dark, the front door slightly crooked, but otherwise the cabin looked untouched by time. I walked up to the door and inserted the old key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The inside was just as I remembered, simple but cozy, with a small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a loft where the beds were. Dust covered most of the surfaces, and the air smelled stale, but otherwise the cabin seemed perfectly preserved. I spent the next hour unpacking my gear and cleaning up a bit, wiping down the counters and sweeping the floor. Once everything was settled, I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat back, enjoying the warmth and the comforting crackle of the flames. The sun had set by now, and the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. It was exactly what I needed: quiet, peaceful, and completely isolated. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to settle over me. At first, it was just a vague sense of unease, like the cabin was too quiet. I brushed it off as nerves after all. I hadn't been here in years, and it was my first time staying alone. The isolation was bound to make me feel a little jumpy. I ate a quick dinner and settled into one of the old armchairs by the fire, listening to the wind howling softly outside. The cabin creaked occasionally, the wood groaning as the temperature dropped, but otherwise the night was silent. But then I heard it. A soft thud from somewhere outside the cabin. I froze, listening intently, my heart starting to race. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, but the thud had been distinct, different from the natural sounds of the forest. I stood up slowly, glancing toward the front door. The cabin had no electricity, and I had only the fire and a few old lanterns for light. The windows were dark, reflecting the dim glow of the fire inside, but I couldn't see anything beyond them. Another thud. This time it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the cabin, maybe near the back door. I grabbed one of the lanterns and lit it, the small flame flickering weakly in the darkness. My hand shook slightly as I lifted the lantern and walked toward the back of the cabin, the wooden floorboards creaking under my feet. The back door was closed, just as I had left it, but as I approached, I heard another sound, a soft, scraping noise, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. I opened the door and stepped outside, holding the lantern up to illuminate the area around me. Nothing. Nothing. The wind howled through the trees and the dark forest loomed all around, but there was no sign of anything unusual. No animals, no tracks, just the cold, empty night. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the chill air, straining to hear any other sounds. But the thudding had stopped, and the scraping was gone. Maybe it was just a branch, I told myself, or an animal brushing against the cabin. There were plenty of raccoons and deer in these woods. It wasn't unusual for them to wander close. I took a deep breath and stepped back inside, closing the door firmly behind me. I placed the lantern on the kitchen counter and returned to the living area, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But as I sat by the fire, my mind kept going back to the sound. It hadn't been the wind. I was sure of that. And it hadn't sounded like an animal either. It had been too deliberate, too. Heavy. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but the cabin suddenly felt much smaller, the shadows cast by the fire longer and darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. As the fire began to die down, I decided to head to bed, hoping sleep would take my mind off things. I climbed up the narrow wooden ladder to the loft, where two old beds were tucked under the slanted roof. I picked the one furthest from the window, threw my sleeping bag over the mattress, and lay down, staring up at the wooden beams above me. But sleep didn't come. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up outside, and every noise made my heart race. I couldn't stop thinking about the thud, the scraping, the feeling that something had been outside the cabin, watching. I told myself it was just my imagination. The isolation was playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin was silent. The fire had died out completely, leaving the room in total darkness. I reached for my phone to check the time, 2:17 a.m. I lay there for a moment, listening to the silence, trying to figure out what had woken me up. And then I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak coming from downstairs. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of floorboards groaning under the weight of something, or someone, moving through the cabin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard any windows break, but there was no denying it, something was downstairs. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. Maybe it was just the wind again, or the old wood shifting in the cold night air. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I lay there, completely still, listening to the slow, deliberate creaks coming from the living room. Whatever it was moving slowly, carefully, as if trying not to make too much noise. I grabbed the old lantern I had left by the bed and lit it, the small flame flickering weakly in the darkness. My hands shook as I climbed out of bed and crept toward the ladder, peering down into the living room below. The cabin was empty. The fire had long since gone out, leaving the room in near total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the lantern in my hand. But then I saw it. The front door. It was wide open, the cold night air blowing into the cabin. I stared at the door, my heart racing, trying to remember if I had locked it before going to bed. I was sure I had. I always locked the door. But now it was standing open, the darkness of the forest beyond it, silent and still. I backed away from the ladder, my hands trembling, and slowly descended, keeping the lantern held high. I didn't know what I expected to find, but every step felt like it took an eternity. When I reached the bottom, I scanned the room. Nothing was out of place. The chairs were still by the fire, the table untouched. But the door, it hadn't been opened before. I approached it slowly, every instinct screaming at me to shut it and lock it. But when I reached for the handle, something stopped me. There, in the soft dirt just outside the door, were footprints. They were large, far too large to be mine, and they led away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. My blood ran cold. I slammed the door shut, threw the lock, and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea who or what had been outside my cabin that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. And I wasn't staying another minute to find out what had been watching me. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and left the cabin, running through the dark forest, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand. I didn't stop until I reached my car, breathless and terrified. I haven't been back to that cabin since. Camping had always been a way for me to escape. It wasn't just about nature, it was about getting away from the pressures of daily life, the endless stream of emails, and the constant noise of the city. I preferred to camp in isolated places, deep in the woods, where I could be alone with my thoughts. That's why I had chosen this particular spot, miles away from any road, at the edge of a small, crystal-clear lake nestled in the middle of a thick forest. The day had been beautiful. I spent the morning hiking, exploring the area around the lake, and in the afternoon I fished by the shore. There wasn't a soul for miles, and the only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface of the water. By the time the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow over the lake, I felt at peace. I set up my tent just a few yards from the water, the flap facing the lake so I could wake up to the sunrise over the water. I lit a small fire, cooked a simple dinner, and then sat back to enjoy the fading light as the sky turned from pink to purple, then deepened into the inky black of night. It was one of those nights that felt almost magical. The stars were out in full force, twinkling above the towering trees, and the air was cool but not too cold. I sat by the fire, sipping hot tea and listening to the quiet of the forest. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the starry sky like a mirror. It was everything I had wanted a night of perfect solitude. But as the fire began to die down, a strange feeling settled over me. It started as a subtle sensation, a vague unease that I couldn't quite place. The kind of feeling you get when you think you've forgotten something important, but you can't remember what it is. I glanced around the clearing, the flickering light of the fire casting long shadows across the trees, but everything looked the same as it had before. The forest was quiet, the lake still. There was nothing out of place. Still, the feeling persisted. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I had spent too much time alone, that was all. My mind was playing tricks on me. I stood up, stretched, and decided it was time to head to bed. I poured the last of my tea into the fire, dousing the remaining flames, and turned toward my tent. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It was just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the weak moonlight, but unmistakably there. A figure, standing perfectly still, half hidden behind one of the tall pine trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring at the shape. It didn't move. It was just standing there, watching me. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light, just the way the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting odd shadows. But as I squinted into the darkness, my stomach twisted in fear. It was a person. I couldn't see their face, couldn't make out any details, but there was no doubt about it. Someone was standing at the edge of the clearing, just watching me. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. Is someone there? Still nothing. The air felt colder now, and the quiet of the forest, which had been peaceful just moments before, now felt oppressive. The figure remained motionless, a dark silhouette at the edge of my camp, blending into the shadows of the trees. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack, my hands shaking as I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the clearing, the edge of the camp, but when I pointed it toward the figure, there was nothing there. The shadow was gone. My breath caught in my throat, and I swept the flashlight back and forth, searching the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No rustling of leaves, no sound of footsteps, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I stood there, heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light? But I knew what I had seen. There had been someone standing there watching me. The feeling of unease grew stronger, and I quickly made my way to my tent, zipping the flap shut behind me. My hands were still trembling as I crawled into my sleeping bag, the flashlight resting beside me within easy reach. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence outside. Every little sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, lurking just beyond the trees, watching my tent. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing happened. No footsteps, no voices, no shadows. The forest remained silent, and slowly, I began to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it really had been a trick of the light. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But the peace didn't last long. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what had woken me up at first. There hadn't been any loud noises, no rustling outside the tent. But as I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, I felt it. Someone was outside. The air in the tent felt thick, oppressive, and my skin prickled with the undeniable sensation that I wasn't alone. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound, any movement. And then I heard it. A soft, shuffling noise coming from just outside the tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the perimeter of my camp. My heart raced and I grabbed the flashlight, flicking it on. The light was weak, the batteries already starting to die, but I pointed it toward the tent flap, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, frozen, the flashlight trembling in my hand, waiting for something to happen. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the night. But then, from just outside the tent, I heard it again. A soft whisper. Low, unintelligible, but unmistakably human. My breath caught in my throat, and I clutched the flashlight tighter, my mind racing. Who was out there? What were they doing? I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to speak, couldn't bring myself to move. The fear was too overwhelming, too paralyzing. The whisper came again, this time louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from right next to the tent, just inches away from where I sat frozen in terror. I flicked the flashlight off, plunging the tent into darkness, and backed up against the far side of the tent, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting, praying that whoever or whatever was outside would go away. The footsteps resumed, circling the tent slowly, deliberately, and then stopped directly in front of the tent flap. I held my breath, every nerve in my body screaming with fear. The zipper of the tent flap moved, slowly, inch by inch. I shot forward, gripping the zipper and pulling it closed with shaking hands, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel the weight of the presence just outside the thin fabric of the tent, the air thick with tension, but I couldn't bring myself to open the flap, to confront whatever was out there. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. The footsteps faded into the distance, disappearing into the quiet of the forest, and the whispering stopped. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the silence of the night returned. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I sat there, huddled in the corner of the tent, the flashlight clutched in my hand, waiting for the footsteps to return. But they never did. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the fabric of the tent, I crawled out, blinking in the pale morning light. The clearing was empty, the lake perfectly still, and there was no sign that anyone had been there during the night. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, my hands still trembling from the fear that had gripped me throughout the night. I didn't bother with breakfast. I didn't even look back at the lake. I just grabbed my gear and left, hiking back to the trailhead as fast as I could. I don't know who or what had been outside my tent that night. I don't know if I had imagined the whole thing, or if someone had been watching me, lurking just beyond the trees. But I do know one thing: I haven't camped alone since. And I never will again.